Good evening, folks. Welcome back here for the spring semester 2012. Before we get started, any students here for Professor Moulton's class, you can sign up. He has a sheet on the table there, so if you're here for Professor Moulton's class, please sign a sheet in the back there. My name is Bart Frazier. I'm Program Director with the Future Freedom Foundation, and haven't seen you guys since November, so I thought I'd give you a little rundown as to what we've been doing. First of all, if none of you have caught Jacob Hornberger's show, he does a live internet show every Saturday night at 7 p.m. So if you just go to FFF's Ustream webpage at 7 o'clock on Saturday nights, he gives an hour-long talk live every Saturday on current events, an uncompromising libertarian take on current events of the day. We also have all of our speakers lined up for this spring edition of the Economic Liberty Lecture Series. Of course, tonight we have Claudia Williamson. We have Scott Sumner next month and Ben Powell in April. And if you didn't see any of our emails, we recently just completed a Civil Liberties College tour, a panel with Jacob Hornberger, Bruce Fine, and Glenn Greenwald, where we hit 4 colleges across the Northeast and the Midwest, talking about civil liberties, the war on terrorism, and the Constitution. All the videos from that are available on our website. We also wrapped that up this last Saturday with kind of a finale of that panel at the Students for Liberty Conference. I know that some of you were there. We did not have Glenn, unfortunately, for that, but it was still a nice wrap-up, and we have the video for that as well. To give you a quick rundown of FFF, if you're not familiar with us, we are a libertarian educational foundation whose mission is to spread an uncompromising vision of a free society, individual liberty, economic liberties, and we do it through a variety of methods, venues like this, the printed word, and of course the internet. If you go to our website, you'll see that we have over 4,000 original articles. We also send out a daily email that we consider the finest libertarian newsletter that you can get. It's free for the asking if you just send an email to fff@fff.org with subscribe in the subject. We'll get you signed up for that. And last but not least, I would encourage you to sign up for the Gmu Econ Society. If you are an undergrad, it's a wonderful group of people, extremely motivated, lovers of liberty. They're the ones who are responsible for putting this on. And with that, I'd like to introduce Carly, President of the Gmu Econ Society.
Hi, my name's Carly Reddick, and I'm the president of the Gmu Econ Society. The Econ Society is a student organization that introduces students to the economic way of thinking. We organize lecture series, discussion sessions, and other interactions between professional economists and students. If you'd like to learn more about the Econ Society, just talk to me after the lecture or talk to some of the officers. They're sitting over there, Cole, my brother, Rachel, Jamie. Tonight we have Claudia R. Williamson with us. Claudia Williamson is a postdoctoral fellow at the Development Research Institute of NYU and will start teaching at Mississippi State in the fall. Her research focuses on applied microeconomics, the political economy of development, and the effectiveness of development policies such as foreign aid. She completed her Ph.D. in economics at West Virginia University in May 2008, where her dissertation considered the importance of informal institutions for economic development. She spent the 2007-2008 year at GMU as the F.A. Hayek Visiting Scholar in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, extending her research on the political economy of property rights institutions. She has authored numerous articles in referee journals, contributed multiple chapters to edited books, and performed fieldwork on land titling in rural Peru. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Claudia Williamson.
All right, well, thank you, and thank everyone for coming out tonight. And I'm going to be giving basically a general overview of the trouble with foreign aid. And basically the trouble with it is that we give it, or that it exists, but I understand that I need to spend a little bit more time filling up the next hour. So we'll just be going over some basic arguments, some background information, the history of aid, and then why it hasn't worked, understanding the theory behind it, and also some of the evidence, and basically why some people are still supporters of giving aid.
Excuse me, could you stand in front of the microphone?
Sure. Do you have a preference as to which one?
Definitely the shorter one. If you
All right. So I don't know how clearly you actually can see this picture, but this is just a general snapshot of getting a good contrast of the developed places in the world and the not so developed places in the world. And actually this is becoming, using light density as a measure for development instead of using GDP is becoming actually pretty common in development. But this just gives you a really good snapshot view of where you can see all of the places that are lit up, obviously, are the more developed places. And what we're trying to understand is to basically light up the rest of the world. And foreign aid is supposedly one of these tools that we've been using for about the past 60 years to do so. Just to give some basic statistics, lower or lower middle income countries make up more than half of the world's economies, and by definition that means less than about $3,500 per capita per year is what the people live off of. So that's more than 1.1 billion people subsist on less than $1 a day. And whenever we give these statistics, they are actually adjusted for purchasing power. So that is actually what it would be like trying to live on $1 a day, say in the U.S. And actually people, I remember seeing in New York City, people like tweeting and blogging about going out and what it would be like to try to live on $1 a day. So that is supposed to adjust for the different purchasing powers across different countries. And in some places, more than 70% actually live on about $2 a day. So this is what we mean when we're trying to get an idea of developed and underdeveloped, or you hear third world or poor people. This is the reality. This is what we're talking about. So about 7.6 million children died in 2010, with 1.7 million dying from preventable diseases. So these are a lot of the statistics and still the reasons why you'll hear supporters for health interventions, for example, because these things seem as if it's something that we should be able to prevent. There's a lot of other, basic statistics out there. 1 out of every 5 children basically underweight. So that's what we're talking about in terms of trying to help the poor. So the legacy of the Depression is obviously built into a lot of the mentality around foreign aid. So part of the UN history, if you actually read through some of the history in the manuals and the documents that the UN puts out, it says economic development is not spontaneous, but consciously achieved through state planning. So there's no ambiguity as to what it is that the UN thinks our mental model is in terms of looking at how you achieve economic development. And also Nobel laureate Mordahl says, basically the only way that we're going to prevent economic stagnation is by planning by experts, which he obviously thought that he was. So again, this mentality around this time really has shaped the economic development as a field, and then the approach of using aid as an instrument within that. So this is a very brief history of foreign aid and where it began and basically where we're at today. So 1944 at Bretton Woods is where the World Bank and the IMF were created. And they were basically created for international finance reasons, for international security and finance reasons. But quickly after that, we get the Marshall Plan, the 1950s after World War II, for post-war reconstruction reasons. And actually, ironically, in some sense, the Marshall Plan is one of these token examples that I usually get asked about whenever I'm talking about foreign aid as being the thing, the model, the thing that we should be trying to implement again. And it's a little bit of a different scenario because, again, it was reconstruction efforts where these countries were developed at one time, and it was just basically, it was rebuilding the infrastructure, whereas economic development, in the sense that we're talking about today, they've never had any of those institutions or infrastructure ever in place there. So from that, we move through the 60s, industrialization policies, where really it's about building infrastructure, building roads, building the buildings. But then basically from the 70s onward is where we get this notion of using foreign aid to break the vicious circle of poverty. So the idea is that people are poor and they can't save enough. They basically make just enough money to subsist. So they consume all of the money that they make. So there's nothing left over in terms of being able to save. And because of that, they can't save enough to then invest and then break this vicious circle. So, the short version of that is they're poor because they're poor. So Jeffrey Sachs, who we'll come back to in just a second, is one of the big proponents of this idea, where all we need to do then is we can derive the model and figure out the exact amount of aid to break this vicious circle of poverty and turn it into a virtuous one, so we can fill the financing gap or the investment gap. And this is still the way that the World Bank actually comes up with the amount of aid to give countries, is based on this notion that there is a investment and a financing gap, and aid can actually fill that gap that then sets these countries on a different path. So again, that's the overarching backdrop that we've seen throughout the last 30 to 40 years. It take, again, a variety of forms. Through the 80s, it was more about structural lending, so we had a lot of debt refinancing issues. In the 1990s is where we get the Washington Consensus, which is probably what most people are familiar with if you've done much with aid at all. The Washington Consensus emerged actually, it was by John Williamson in 1989. He was putting together something that he thought wasn't controversial, and everyone was coming together to meet at a conference, and he thought, well, let's just come up with about 10 different bullet points that everyone in Washington would agree on is good for development. And obviously not everyone in Washington actually agreed on these things, and it was very pro-market. It was very market-friendly, such as advocating free trade, stable money, so things that actually you would learn in Econ 101. And it's not that controversial, but in the development community, among economists, most people actually probably would agree on these basic principles, but in the development community and the World Bank, it became very controversial. And part of the reason with that is that in talking about these different policy prescriptions, such as free trade, property rights, and stable money, stable currency, not fixing the exchange rate, the institutional conversation behind that was actually lacking. So then we moved from, talking about very specific policies to talking about the institutional environment. And the basic form that that's actually taken is looking at failed states and then also promoting democracy. Even though the World Bank is still one organization that won't verbalize and actually put down dictatorships. So a lot of aid agencies actually will come out and say, no, we're only going to support democratic regimes, we're not going to support corrupt dictatorships, but the World Bank claims to be neutral on this policy, and they actually won't say things that we're not going to support a corrupt dictatorship. They still very much do that through the form of lending. So we move to today, basically, and really the way that if you want to think about the flow of this is it's gone from more specific. So if you look at maybe the Marshall Plan as here's something specific in terms of a reconstruction effort that we want to achieve. We can build the bridge back that was blown up by a bomb. We can build the road. To now, foreign aid is trying to fix basically everything. So it's combining aid with military interventions, and it's not only peacekeeping, but it's also economic development and political development. So we're supposed to be fixing all of these problems. And so it's gone from possibly specific policies to the broadest, biggest goal of basically ending world poverty, which is obviously a pretty big goal to try and achieve. So again, if you're not familiar, basically when we're talking about foreign aid, we are talking about government-to-government aid, which is bilateral aid, or multilateral aid, which are the multilateral institutions of the World Bank, or the IMF, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank. There's actually over about 45 to 55 different aid agencies, so there's quite a few. So it's not just the U.S., it's not just the World Bank. There are a lot of different aid agencies that are being created pretty frequently in the past, probably 5 or 10 years. We've seen a lot of other multilateral agencies actually pop up. And so humanitarian relief is actually included when we're talking about foreign aid. So even though the government-to-government aid or multilateral doesn't include private charity or NGOs specifically, it does include humanitarian and emergency relief. It doesn't include military aid. And it'll include if, say, the U.S., for example, gives money out of the aid budget to an NGO, that is included in this, but all NGO spending, for the most part, is not. So just, again, to give you the background, because a lot of times people ask about, private groups and private organization, and that isn't in this specific conversation. So this is basically charting just total aid from 1960 through 2009. and there's been an onward and upward trend. So there's been times when it's been somewhat cyclical and it'll dip down, but for the most part, it's very much increasing in absolute terms. And the big spike there was actually aid to Iraq and Afghanistan. So at the end, that's what it fell back down, and now it is increasing again. So the Millennium Development Goals is basically the blueprint of how aid is supposed to be structured. So in 2000, all of the aid donors got together and they came up with an outline and a model of the goals that it is that they want to achieve. And they're called the Millennium Development Goals. And by 2015, these are the different specifics that we're supposed to have met with aid. So cutting poverty in half. And again, these are somewhat arbitrary goals because you have to be able to measure the starting points as to what is your definition of poverty, because obviously when I was even giving you the definitions at the beginning, they're not concrete. So is it $1 a day? Is it $2 a day? But so basically, cut poverty in half, have universal primary enrollment, just reduce infant maternal mortality, achieve gender equality. Again, I'm not even sure what that means. And then increase access to clean water and other social indicators. So we have an idea. We have this blueprint of what aid now is supposed to be doing, but it's trying to evaluate whether or not it actually is. And here's a Human Development Report, 2005, makes the claim that aid is one of the most powerful weapons against the war on poverty, but there's no evidence to actually back this up. So that's something else that you'll find if you actually take time to, say, read World Bank documents. The UN is notorious for doing things like that. They just basically make stuff up. So again, this is just evidence. There's nothing to back up this claim, but it gets a lot of traction. It gets traction in the media. It gets a lot of support. So again, it just perpetuates the whole concept. So theoretically, we basically have two contrasting hypotheses of, we want to just put them in two different camps. We have Jeff Sachs, and who's the other guy? Everybody knows? Yeah, Bono. So this is what I call basically the public interest view. Just the idea that we have a moral duty. There's something that we have to do. We see people starving. We see children dying from diseases that can be prevented. It pulls at your heartstrings. It makes you feel bad. So obviously we have to try and achieve something. It's very much a normative position. But Sachs does fall back on the vicious cycle of poverty model where we have, you can derive mathematically this beautiful formula and model that shows, oh yeah, they can't save enough, and here's the gap. And to Sachs, it's 195 billion per year. If we would give that from 2000 to 2025, then we would end world poverty. So he actually has the exact amount and the exact number, and he knows that if we would just follow his advice, then by 2025 we would end world poverty. Paul Collier is another supporter of this. Armada Sen doesn't come out exactly the same way that Sachs does, but he is a supporter, again, of this more moral implication and notice that, we shouldn't just be focusing on economic development, but, we have a duty, and Development is Freedom is basically the book, if you're familiar with that, where health, for example, is an area that we could see successes, and again, we have this duty to try and do something about that. Standing on the other side is the public choice view or perspective, which takes much more of a positive or means-ends analysis that says, okay, well, putting aside any of the moral implications, maybe we can't achieve these Millennium Development Goals. Let's just actually do some analysis. Let's use some economics and see if we actually can do any good with the money that we're spending. So do you guys know who's up here next? Lord Bauer. P.T. Bauer is awesome. And also in this camp is William Easterly, which most people would then be familiar with. But again, just championing the idea of using the economic way of thinking to actually analyze what aid can and cannot do. So putting them head to head, we have Bono and Sachs going in for the real thing. And then Easterly over there, it's little African tour. But basically, it's a way of thinking about, theoretically, the two different camps in development and where we stand. And of course, celebrities get on board with this. It's not just Bono. Angelina's another one that Jeff Sachs likes to hang out with. Madonna, Maya Angelou, Brad Pitt, everybody gets on board with, they see poverty and they don't like it, and they think, well, there's something obviously that we can do about it, and they do different campaigns, and they try to motivate people and take an activist stance. But the problem is that aid isn't working. So it's nice to, I guess, care, but then you have to follow up with, okay, I care about this, but how am I going to actually do something about it? And most of them always champion using government foreign aid. So it's not even, Bono does have his own NGO, but he still champions the idea of we just need more government aid. We need more spending by, each donor country, and then that's how we're going to get results. So this goes back to it's the big push model, or what I was describing as the investment gap that the World Bank uses in terms of deriving the amount of aid that can fill the investment gap. And so this is the predicted path from 1960 to 2000 of how countries would grow that were going to be receiving aid. So the top-down central planning notion of receiving aid. So this is using the big push model that the World Bank still uses to predict the growth rate and per capita income of these countries. And here is reality. So it doesn't really match up. And we have enough data to actually go back in time. So this isn't a problem that we haven't done this experiment long enough. We actually have enough evidence, and we've been doing this for over 50 years, that shows that aid isn't working. Some other statistics and examples was that for about 50 years we've given out $4.6 trillion. 2010 it was $164 billion, dispersed by 45 donors that went to almost 100,000 different projects. So one of the other problems actually with trying to evaluate the effectiveness of aid is that the data on this has been horrible because the donors aren't very transparent at all. It's actually still quite difficult to get detailed information of where the money is going, so then you can actually evaluate it. And the donors themselves actually don't do really any real evaluation. So just recently there's been a big push for transparency and for better data, and one of it is looking at aid at actually the project level. So most of the data that we have is just how much did the U.S. give to Afghanistan, for example? How much did the U.S. give to the health sector? So it's very surface level and hard to track the actual impact and where the aid actually is going. And the U.S. dispersed $27 billion of that 164, so it is the largest donor in an absolute sense, and supported over 15,000 projects just in 2010 alone. So not only is it a lot of money, but one of the other problems that's cited is that basically donors have an incentive to spread the money to every sector in every country, basically, because they want to, plant their flag everywhere. Say, I'm helping this country, I'm helping this sector. So they're doing everything, but what ends up happening is basically they're doing nothing. $568 billion flowed into Africa over the past 42 years, and the per capita growth rate of the median African nation is basically zero. So in terms of using aid to achieve economic growth, no effect. And most of the evidence out there, so if you actually reading the academic studies over and over and over and over again, support the public choice perspective. So all of the evidence falls on the side of Bauer and Easterly, not on Sachs's side. However, Sachs is still winning the intellectual debate. It's still a more attractive argument. And one of the other successes that people like to claim in terms of aid is China and India and Vietnam. However, their aid budget was a very small percent of GDP. So you can't fall into the fallacy of, oh, this country is successful and has a positive growth rate, and they also received aid, therefore aid is successful. When you actually look at the country level evidence, aid was a very small percent of the GDP in these countries, and basically, again, had no real effect on getting them on their virtuous cycle. So Dambisa Moyo is an African finance person turned journalist who has the book Dead Aid, and she actually is now taking up more of Bauer's original arguments of saying that it's not just that aid has no effect. So Easterly's a little bit more on the side of making the argument that what the evidence tells us is it's having zero effect, whereas Bauer and now Moyo is supporting the notion is that actually it's not that it's zero effect, it's a harmful effect, and that aid is actually the problem. So, did I go? Okay, no, that's right. So one way of thinking about this is that development isn't a technological problem, but people such as Sachs and some of the people that are working on the randomized controlled experiments, for example, view these issues more of a technological problem. So this is, if you want to think of it, like their way of viewing the world and their way of solving the development problems. So basically you just identify some problem out there. For example, and the vitamin A deficiency, and that's because the vitamin A solutions, the capsules, are cited again as one of these areas in which aid is successful. So they want to follow this same model and just basically keep replicating it with every single problem that you can identify. So identify the problem, and now we know what the solution is. So you just make this solution available by providing the sufficient amount of funding, and you do the same exercise over and over and over again, and that's how aid financing leads to the solutions that basically ends poverty. But as we know, aid money isn't spending itself. It's not just being dropped out of the sky. And the technology, so even if it is a technological problem, which some of these issues are, so some of the health issues are technological problems, and the solutions to them have been known for decades. But humans spend aid money and implement the actual technology. And we can have basically broken links in the chain through this. So this is where, okay, it's time to actually look at what incentives are the donors facing, what incentives are the recipient governments facing, and then also look at the knowledge problems and the knowledge constraints that's going to exist on both sides of this issue. So the recipient country constraints, there are many, but just summarizing a few, if you want to think of it. One issue is that these countries are poor in large part because they lack the good institutions. So obviously private property rights and good governance, if you want to think of it that way. So what all you're doing is that you're giving this pot of money to that government. So even if it's coming from the U.S., if it's coming from the World Bank, the money still gets channeled through the government. So they're not working around the state. It's not like an NGO model, say, and going on the ground at the ground level. The foreign aid, and this is the way that it advocates still want it to be used, is to still go through the recipient government. And so all that this ends up doing actually is concentrating the power of the political elite, those who are actually already in charge. And those who are in charge are doing a relatively bad job if their country is still poor. So it just concentrates the power. The other thing is that it actually is going to be subsidizing and possibly hiding the bad policies that this government or the regime, the state there, is actually undertaking, which then obviously is going to creates a dependency and a moral hazard issue. And the moral hazard issue, and Bauer was a proponent of this argument where, look, if the government is engaging in bad policies that's keeping the countries poor, and now instead of having to say reform or rely on the citizens to actually pay taxes or be productive and pay taxes, so there's no feedback mechanism between the citizen and the recipient government, you're breaking that link by giving now the funding through a foreign source. It just creates the incentive for that regime to actually still harbor an environment that would then, the next budget cycle, you would still want to be able to receive aid. So they actually have the exact opposite of incentive of achieving growth or finding solutions to these problems, because as the politicians see it, this is now just, padding their budget. And it's a lot easier to get aid from a donor than, say, again, like try to make a productive environment where you actually have to be based on tax revenue. It also distorts economic activity, distorts market incentives. So for example, food aid is one of the U.S. is probably the worst for actually giving food aid, but basically any surplus that the U.S. has in terms of grain or rice, for example, just send it over to a poor country. Well, there are farmers there. There are people there who are also trying to create this product, whatever it is. And so now you've just distorted or possibly wiped out their entire base by coming in and giving it away for free. So it distorts any real incentives to be entrepreneurial and rely on the market mechanism. Also, there's a lot of rent seeking that's going to go on in the recipient country in terms of once they know basically this pot of gold is going to keep coming in, then as an individual there, you're going to start lobbying the government for whatever sector it is that it's coming in through. So in Ethiopia, 60% of the health aid budget is going to HIV prevention, even though, and only a very small percent is going to malaria prevention, even though they're at a much higher risk of malaria than HIV. And part of the reason why is that there are lobbyist groups there in Ethiopia that are lobbying for the HIV, and so it just distorts completely the incentives in the budget. Also, there's a lot of survey data, and just talking with individuals, and one of the questions is, what is, for your children, what type of job would you want them to have? And it's basically to be a government bureaucrat. It's basically to work for and depend on the aid budget. So this is something, obviously, that now it's created this culture of dependency, and what they're actually encouraging their children to do is to be be part of the system of the state. Instead of relying on the market, instead of being entrepreneurial, instead of trying to solve the problems from the ground up and based on, the knowledge that they have there. It also, basically following from that, just changes the rules of the game. It starts to change the institutional environment. So that's just some of the perverse incentives from the recipient side. Obviously, just any type of central planning that's happening, you're going to face the same knowledge constraints. But the problem with aid is that we have dual layers of this. So not only do we have the recipient level knowledge constraints, but we also are going to have the donor level as well. And so it's just a very basic knowledge problem argument where aid is going through bureaucracies, and there's no feedback, there's no market mechanism there, and there's no profit and loss system to signal where it's successful and when it's not successful, where it should be channeled. We're relying on bureaucracy. And again, as a budget maximizer, bureaucrats just want to push money out the door. And so even once they get the agency itself, whatever bureaucratic agency, the health ministry, for example, now has a larger budget thanks to aid. So, well, now we just need to spend the money because you want to be able to show the donors that you used it and you need more for the next time around. So very just basic arguments. And this is one of Easterly's biggest points, is that the solution to development isn't from planners, but it's from searchers. And so we need to rely more on the market mechanism, we need to rely more on entrepreneurship and encourage the searchers over the planners. Again, so we have this dual level where not only are we having to deal with perverse incentives and knowledge problems in the recipient country, but also in the donor country as well. And so we'll just walk through some of these. Special interest obviously plays a huge part in our political process and in determining where aid goes. Food aid is one of the best examples of that, because the farmers lobby whenever there's any type of surplus that they don't like or they think it's a surplus, that instead of putting it on the market, they lobby for the U.S. to send it out as aid. So it's basically just dumping in excess to keep the prices higher, and they lobby for different forms of aid to be used like that. Military aid, even though it's not technically included in a lot of this data, is another example of the way firms can lobby the U.S. for money to be spent a certain way for foreign interventions. Obviously, strategic interests matter as well, and the U.S. supports Iraq and Afghanistan, which I'll put up some numbers here in a second. So a lot of aid actually isn't going to the most poor or the ones who need it the most. A lot of aid goes to our allies, or if you're trying to you know, have some other type of interest there. Another example of this is that aid definitely wasn't a tool during the Cold War. So a lot of aid was actually given to, try to fight communism, basically buying off dictatorships that as long as they would claim that they weren't going to become communist, they were a U.S. ally, then we would give them money. Again, same type of bureaucracy problems, because with the perverse incentives, and also then the information side as in the recipient country. So the theory doesn't change if you're talking about the donor or the recipient. It's the same basic economic argument that, they're budget maximizers. They just want to get money out the door. And again, if you actually read through some of these reports, that is how they measure success. So if you even just go to USAID's website, they have links to successful stories. All it is telling you is how much money they've spent. So it actually has nothing to do with results. So it's very much the budget maximizer idea. And, again, next time around, oh, well, we spent, X amount and we need more. Public opinion also matters a tremendous amount. Again, looking at, that's why Sachs and Bono and Angelina and everybody doing this big activist movement, trying to get the public opinion to shift towards that side. But also, on top of that, is that basically you still just have, a rational, ignorant voter model where a citizen in the U.S., for example, doesn't have an incentive to figure out exactly what's going on and then discipline the politicians if they say, give food aid, for example, instead of supporting free trade or something like that. It's a very obviously complicated problem. So when you see Angelina and Brad walking around and talking about how great aid is, it's just easier to be like, oh yeah, that's something that you should support, instead of actually becoming a rationally informed voter. Another thing is that it's very difficult to monitor. Like I said, even as an academic, as you're trying to study this and get the actual data, so investing a large amount of time, it's very difficult to find the numbers, to find out where the money goes and where the money went. And so again, if the agency, USAID, knows this, for example, they have no real incentive to actually perform well, because nobody's watching them. There's no feedback and there's no accountability. And then the Samaritan's Dilemma idea is basically that there's no reason also then, there's no incentive basically to punish. So if you give money to Afghanistan and there's, conditions attached saying you have to do X, Y, and Z, the next time around the country hasn't done X, Y, and Z, well, they're still poor, and there's still people starving and children dying, and so you feel bad, and so you give again. So it just creates a perverse cycle of where there's no incentive for the recipient to reform, and then it becomes that there's no incentive for the bureaucratic reasons to actually then discipline and say to not give aid the next time around. And again, then the same basic knowledge problems idea in the donor country, except it's even once further removed, because as you're trying to do foreign intervention, so there's no way that you're going to understand the local knowledge issues and constraints, being even further removed than just the recipient level government. So I'm not sure how clearly this is coming through, but if it just looks like a bunch of boxes with words, that's fine, because it's basically meaningless. But this is just the World Bank organizational chart that shows how, so at the top, the money is going to channel from citizens of rich countries down to citizens of an African country. So this is all the links in the chain that it's going to go through, such as the rich nation's governments, then a board of directors, and then the director general, and then the president, managing director, and then we start getting to the VP for Africa, VP for poverty reduction, the vice president for human development. This is bureaucracy. So this is how the World Bank thinks that we can actually solve the development problem. So here's some of this example of the strategic interest from 2000-2009. Afghanistan received $11 billion from the U.S. in aid, and this is outside military aid, by the way. This is supposed to be economic development. Iraq received $31 billion, and obviously previous decade much smaller. So since the war on terror, you can see a dramatic shift. So this is not a benevolent reason for the reasons why we're giving aid. There's obviously the other interests coming into play. So here's numbers for aid going to dictatorships from 2004 to 2008. The U.S., and this is from Parade's top 20 worst dictators. So just summing how much aid the United States gave: $46 billion to the worst dictators, more than twice the amount that the next in line, which was Japan, gave. And the top recipient actually is China, then Vietnam, Sudan. So as you can see, again, it's not that we're supporting the least well-off or giving aid in the institutional environment that could possibly have an effect. That's the other argument stemming in this literature, where Burnside and Dollar had a paper that showed, well, if you give aid in the right institutional environment, the interaction with that actually does have a positive and significant relationship with growth. But Easterly did a follow-up with that. That's once you extend the data, that doesn't actually hold, but nobody cares about that, the follow-up. Everybody just got on board with the, oh, if you give in the right institutional environment, then aid can be effective. The problem, even from that, besides that it's not true, is that we still don't give in the right institutional environment. So again, there's no real incentive to reform. And here is aid and public opinion from U.S. data that shows the big blue line is the percent of Americans that think that that's the amount we spend on aid as a percent of our budget. So over like 25% is how much people in the United States think that the United States actually spends on foreign aid. The red line is the amount that they think we should spend, and the orange is the amount we actually do. So obviously, rational ignorance on display. One other issue, and actually some people might not think that this is a problem, but that you could think that you're giving aid to finance a power plant and you're actually financing a brothel. So it's a fungibility argument that once you support, or basically hand over the money and you say, okay, we're going to give, $10 million for education. Well, all the donor or the recipient government has to do is just take the amount they were going to spend on education, and now that's freed up, and they can finance it for their bachelor pad or for whatever else it is that they want to do. So there's this fungibility argument that even if you can put strings attached to the aid and enforce it and follow it, you still have unintended consequences from doing this. Now, something that's actually interesting, again, about the development community, it's not as if they're ignorant of these arguments or of the data or of the evidence, and they actually confess the ignorance. So here's a few quotes. Solow obviously won the Nobel Prize. Says, in real life, it's very hard to move the permanent growth rate, and when it happens, the source can be a bit mysterious, even after the fact. It's basically saying we have no idea what determines economic growth. A World Bank report, despite the billions of dollars spent on development assistance each year, there's still very little known about the actual impact of the projects on the poor. So it's, again, not that people at the World Bank aren't even acknowledging this. It's that, again, there's no real incentive to change behavior. And then the Spence Growth Commission, who had a $4 million budget to study this question, says it's hard to know how the economy will respond to a policy, and the right answer in the present moment may not apply in the future. So again, just basically saying, yeah, we have no idea, but let's keep doing the same thing, and actually let's keep doing more of it. So this leads us to a question of kind of where we're at with the aid conversation. So it's, what can aid do? All right, so aid hasn't been successful in the past. People refuse to give up on it. It's just like, for whatever reason, again, going back to Econ 101 isn't an option of looking at some basic principles to uphold. Instead, we need to know, well, what can aid do? And it's the same idea with central planning. It can create more stuff, or it can fund more stuff. So it can build a hospital. It can provide immunizations and give books, build a school. But it doesn't mean, for example, that the parents are actually going to bring the children to the immunization clinic. It doesn't mean that the teachers are going to show up and actually teach children. It doesn't mean the children are going to show up. So there's all of these other issues that the aid community basically doesn't acknowledge. And these are the local knowledge constraints. So where do the randomized controlled experiments fit into this? So if you're familiar with the MIT Poverty Action Lab, or basically one of the most famous development books that's come out in a while is Poor Economics by Banerjee and Duflo, who really spearheaded this whole movement towards doing randomized controls in developing countries to try and figure out solutions to some of these problems. And their basic argument and the way that they pitch it is that, Sachs and Easterly are too meta level. We shouldn't be talking about that aid can achieve or end poverty, that aid at this, can solve the problem of economic development. We just need to look for piecemeal marginal successes. It's like, okay, that sounds good. But the way that, again, that it's going about it is still very much in this technological sense, where they'll look to see, at what price you should have a bed net and see the uptake on that. And guess what they found? Demand curve sloped downwards. So no real surprise there. If you lower the price, more people buy it. So that was one result out of the randomized controls. But basically, this doesn't overcome the knowledge problems. So yes, aid can build a hospital, but again, it doesn't mean that the medicine that's actually been given is going to be the medicine that's needed on the ground. Because again, there's no feedback and there's no market mechanism actually in place. So the way that I think of those who support aid and its approach to development is just basically, when you look at this picture, asking the question, why doesn't somebody just turn the lights on? Obviously, that's not what we're trying to measure. We're not caring about electricity, right? It's what this implies. And the development community who supports the notion of aid, and that we can just, again, build a bridge, build a hospital, and provide immunizations, and then we're going to, see results. It's not the same mental framework as the market mechanism and the actual approach to achieving development. So Easterly's paradox is that development doesn't require any one person, an aid official, a leader, to actually have a comprehensive understanding of development, but that it's based on a lot of bottom-up individual successes and failures. So again, this is relying on the market process, relying on profit and loss to give us a guidance of basically how to achieve development. The problem is that it's still very frustrating to have these conversations, to talk about Hayek, to talk about knowledge problems, to give a very basic, economic explanation for why we have 60 years of data and there's no real evidence to support Sachs or any of the other celebrities that like to support the aid notion. And so Easterly likes to say, well, why is this? Seems like a puzzle, but basically the idea is that one side is a lot more attractive than the other. So the Hayek versus Hayek, come on, which one's going to win out? So hopefully, after this talk, you guys will be more on the F.A. Hayek side, leave Selma out of it. And I'll open it up for questions now.
All right, guys, just raise your hand if you want to ask a question. The mic will not project your voice, so speak loudly, please.
So it's a fake out.
What's that really? Yeah. For your measurement of per capita growth in Africa being zero, you said the median African country was near zero. Median in what sense? What's being measured there?
What do you mean?
You said the median African country's growth was near zero over that period of receiving aid. Median as far as its GDP, or?
Yeah, the growth rate, the GDP growth rate.
The growth rate was zero. But the countries themselves that were measured before it was the median GDP in the country is what you're referring to when you say the median African country experienced zero growth rate.
It's the growth rate. The median growth rate.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So from your talk, it was pretty clear that government foreign aid is not working. I was just curious to know if there's any data on private aid to Africa, like from private nonprofits. Because I can imagine there's a lot of the same knowledge problems, even if you're dealing with a nonprofit. So I was wondering if there's a difference in each, if there's data on that.
So you can get around possibly some of the incentive problems more with, say, a private charity or an NGO. And actually, typically, most private charities or NGOs have a very smaller goal in mind. So it might just be to go into, X country and, just set up one health clinic, for example. So usually the goal is a lot smaller, which means the probability of success is higher, whereas most, large donors have multiple goals conflicting and such. But yes, the same knowledge problems basically exist. It's still more of a central planning type mentality instead of relying on the market. So you're still going to see, and some of the evidence that's come out of the nonprofit work of trying to monitor and do evaluations basically highlight a lot of these same issues that traditional donors face.
So based on your extensive delving into all these issues, now as a scholar, what's your goal to kind of perpetuate this Easterly P.T. Bauer notion of aid is malignant, or is it you want to kind of find out how you can be effective through market processes?
No, it's to end it. Just let's be done with aid.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you want to supplement, like have other economists or other academics focus on how to make it, how to improve the lot of the poverty-stricken?
Well, it's basically, so there's this, but then looking at, okay, well, how do we get, institutional change? And so we're not going to get rid of the aid community. We got to live with it. But it's pretty much how to basically work around it. And that's, again, going back to, well, let's support free trade. Let's do some very basic things that the U.S., for example, doesn't even do. So they want to, we like to provide aid. It sounds good. Again, planting the flag. Oh, look at all these places that we're helping and we're giving money here and there. But then we'll also, raise imports and tariffs on those same countries. So it's, some very basic points like, okay, well, if you really want to help, let's not do that. And even if, like, I'm not, naive to think that we're going to be, like, aid's going to go away, again, because it's institutionalized. So it'll be really difficult to actually do that.
So given what you said about the proportion of people who want to give aid to help these developing countries, and the fact that you say multilateral and bilateral aid is not helping, how do you fill their desires to do something to help the people who are in such dire straits?
So
there's a large
people want to do
desire,
something, what can they do?
There's a high demand
So-
to help these places, and the alternative is to do nothing. It seems
No,
like
it's
it's
not
inevitable
do nothing.
it's going to happen.
It's not to do nothing, actually.
So what is the alternative?
It's just, well, for one thing, don't think that the government can solve the problem. I mean, again, it's not as if it's what your end goal is. If it's to end world poverty, there's no way that that's going to happen. We don't know, first of all. I mean, there's not some, book out there that we just need to keep looking for to discover, and there's the answer, and now we have to just go implement it. We know basic principles that do hold, but it depends on what you define the goal. And so if your goal is to do something, which that could be to go and start a school, then yeah, you can do that. That actually would then can be defined as a success. So that is something that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about successes and failures. It's that systematically aid is a failure. But it's true that there have been aid dollars that's giving a pair of eyeglasses to a child who can now see who otherwise did not see. That is true. That then, if that is how you define a success, then that can be marked as a success. It's just the problem is when you read all of the donor mission statements and what aid, how they talk about aid, that's not their margin of success. Now, the randomized people that work in the randomized controlled experiments are saying, okay, we need to scale it back. We need to come up with different goals. But again, it's then when you see and read the actual studies, and then the way that they talk about that we can use this information is, oh, it is scalable. So it's basically, yeah, you can go in and you can set up an immunization clinic or a place that disperses bed nets, and in that area you would see malaria rates go down. But then they want to take that and replicate that and scale up. And the problem is then you start getting into all of the other knowledge issues and perverse incentives that come into play, and it depends on who is doing this. But if you look at it as in one area, malaria rates went down, well then that can be defined as a success. So it's not to do nothing. And then the other thing is, well, why can't we just talk about how awesome the market is? That's doing something. So again, it's just back to there's some basic things we know that aren't happening there. Not having a political regime that expropriates property rights, for example. Until we get property rights, you're not going to see any type of real development or any real growth. If I did, I wouldn't be here. I'm just kidding. Yeah, I mean, actually, Chris Coyne and I have some work on looking at how you get institutional change and cultural change. And the two areas we've looked at is the importance of free trade and the perverse effect of aid. And so that areas that are more open to trade actually have seen have more of a culture that's conducive to economic growth and development, and the places that are more aid intensive have more of the negative, like lack trust and reciprocity, for example. And so that's basically, like the informal institutions matter, and if they're lacking, that's a problem. Okay, well, how do you get cultural or institutional change? And it can be possibly through the way that we interact with other people. And one way we can interact with them is in a very peaceful, voluntary, cooperative way through trade, and one is from more of a top-down way. And it does show up that the trade is better than aid on that margin as well.
It seems like there's a variety of Western public policies that contribute to African under economic performance, including aid, the legacy of colonialism, closed immigration, and probably environmental and trade regulation and restrictions. I was wondering if there's research that puts magnitude comparisons on these various issues. So if we admit that aid is doing harm, how much is that harm compared to these other policy arenas?
So the empirical evidence doesn't admit that aid does harm. It's Bauer and Moyo it's more of a theoretical argument. And Easterly will even say, well, we don't know the counterfactual. So if you would have taken aid away from African countries over the past 40 years, what would they look like? Well, we don't know. Well, obviously we don't know, but we have an idea and we can talk about it in a theoretical sense. But empirically, you can't discover the counterfactual through the data. And in terms, there's no real comparison between, aid is just as bad as closed immigration or something. I haven't seen anything like that.
Could you please speak a little bit as to how governments use aid as a foreign policy tool? You spoke a little bit about purchasing friendly dictatorships, but could you speak to any research you've done or evidence you come across of them using it as a tool for retribution?
Well, lucky for you guys, we actually have an expert on that exact topic in Professor Coyne, but. I mean, yeah, it happens. It happens a lot, and it's not just in the past 10 years with the war on terror. The political science literature actually does a lot with this, where you see that aid is basically based on political motivations, including different types of military reasons to give to certain countries and not.
The U.S. uses it quite a bit in that fashion. Would you say that other countries do as well?
Other countries do as well. I haven't looked at specifically each country in terms of their military goals and then where they've had military interventions and in terms of where the aid dollars have gone. But what I have done, Easterly and I have a paper where basically we've graded all of the different aid agencies based on different performances. And so on a variety, if they're transparent, their overhead costs, who they give to, so do they give to poor, low middle, high-income countries? Do they support dictatorships versus democracies? And basically, nobody does well. And these are all things, by the way, that the donors, is from the Paris Declaration, and they get to, the agencies actually now are getting together and claiming that they need to reform, and here's the margins that we should reform on. And so Easterly and I have done is just say, okay, well, let's look at to see, are they actually taking the reforms that they say they should be doing? And nobody basically is. So my hunch is that there's no, if a country, a donor has a military goal, they're also using aid to try and achieve it as well. The Scandinavian countries are the ones who are always talked about in this sense as if they're immune to these sorts of things, and what we found out is no, that's not true at all. So on public opinion surveys, they are more altruistic. So, and I've looked at the altruism scores versus the way that the donors actually give, and there's no relationship there. So it's not as if we all just cared more about the poor the way that Bono does, if we could all be, you know, full of love, then everything's going to turn out and be wonderful. The countries who, again, on survey data are more altruistic don't give any better aid than those who aren't. That's a little bit of a tangent off of your original question, but.
Any other questions? How much control does the U.S. have on the monies that the World Bank and the IMF distributes, and how is that control manifested?
I mean, they have a decent amount of power. The U.S. is the largest donor to the World Bank budget. So the U.S. does have a lot of control. I mean, but there's a lot that feeds into that, the structure there. I know that, so the UN agencies performed the worst on the study I was just talking about. They're like by far the absolute worst compared to everybody else. And part of Easterly's thinking with that is actually that every country has a vote, and so you really don't have a residual claimant at all, and so they have absolutely no feedback and monitoring, whereas the World Bank actually is one of the better performing agencies, which is a little bit ironic because the U.S. was worse, but that since there's only really a few countries that have more control of the World Bank budget, they actually are performing better. But the way in which it actually works out on a day-to-day basis, I'm not sure.